On Wednesday, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez denounced the aggressive foreign policy of the United States government against the island and an escalation on its threats and pressures on third countries ahead of the vote at the UN General Assembly on the U.S. blockade. Let's go now live with our correspondent Belen Santos for all the details on this important press conference.
Hello, Luis. Exactly as you were saying, it's the latest news here from Havana, Cuba. The press conference that was offered by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, here in Cuba, with one main objective. Let's put this in the general framework. Next week, the UN General Assembly will once again debate on the resolution to lift the economic blockade imposed by the United States on the island. And in this context, just days before, what the Cuban government, through its Minister of Foreign Affairs, is denouncing is that the United States is carrying out a pressure and threat campaign that is focused and has one objective, that is to pose threats upon third parties and other states in order to change their historical vote. Let's recall that this vote in the General Assembly usually year after year votes with a great majority in favor of lifting the economic blockade. This means that an overwhelming majority of the international community is in favor of lifting these coercive measures and actually are just agreed that this is an international tactic that is against international law. In this context, the U.S. administration, now led by President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, due to this and in this denouncing, they're calling for an international campaign by which they have just submitted letters to different governments around the world, threatening them with the possibility so that they could just change their voting in the General Assembly. So what the Cuban government is exposing with evidence right now, and this is not the first time that we hear from this campaign, actually the Reuters agency also talked about this just days ago, and it says that in two separate letters on October 8th and October 17th, the U.S. government sent documents to governments, particularly of Europe and also of Latin America, threatening them and just telling them that they should change their historical vote in favor of the lifting of the economic blockade on Cuba to a position that is aligned with the United States. Let's recall that usually in this voting, the only state that votes with the United States, aside from itself, is usually its longtime ally Israel, and just one or two maybe allies, as has been the case of Ukraine, for example. And the United States is trying to pressure other states from moving towards that position. What are these letters saying? Well, they are unveiling some threats about possible consequences, negative consequences and impacts that the United States could have on these other states if they do not align with their interest. One of the key elements of these letters was the United States saying that an ally of the United States needs to stand by the U.S. in these debates, or else, something like that. So there is a veiled threat of possible consequences. Let's recall that the Trump administration has been one to use commercial tactics such as the tariff pressure in order to directly interfere in the internal affairs of different countries. This poses just a new scenario for example, the European governments and Latin American governments that have in a great majority been in support of Cuba and also against the United States. One of the main ideas of this press conference that the Minister Bruno Rodriguez held had to do with just unveiling that the United States is trying to impose a narrative that says that Cuba is a threat to regional stability and peace. A threat that is founded in no evidence, is actually just based on unfounded narratives that have been led by misinformation campaigns. Some we have seen during the past weeks, for example, trying to link the just Cuba and the island to conflicts that have absolutely nothing to do with this, like the European conflict between Russia and Ukraine, also by drug trafficking in the region, against baseless foundations and accusations that the Cuban minister said are silly but very dangerous. Why? Because we have seen the U.S. government use this tactics and this narrative, for example, in the Caribbean at this moment, to justify military aggressions and direct acts. So in this context is that we have heard from the Cuban minister explain what is happening at this moment. Again, we are days from one more session of the General Assembly. The blockade will be debated once again, and the Cuban position is that the United States is doing this because it knows that year after year they become isolated in this topic, that the whole international community is denouncing that the blockade is illegal and directly affecting the Cuban people, and they are trying through pressure tactics to change the scenario. So the Cuban government took today to the press to expose these maneuvers. This was all for now, but we'll continue updating this information. I go back to you, Luis.
Thank you, Belen, for the information coming straight from Havana. We'll stay tuned for everything that is going to happen from this moment on all the way until the October 28th and 29th when the voting takes place at the UN General Assembly.